The barometer was falling. Inside the flag-plotting room of the Zuikaku, last surviving carrier of the Pearl Harbor strike force, the air was thick with heat and oil fumes. A young petty officer from the Imperial Japanese Navy's meteorological section leaned over a brass-bound aneroid barometer, tracing the trembling needle with his finger. It had dropped 3 millibars since midnight. Outside, wind scraped across the deck, carrying the smell of salt and ozone. Beneath the faint hum of generators, the Pacific spoke in the language of warning a rising, rolling sea that no doctrine could silence. The petty officer recorded the numbers in his logbook. 0130. Pressure falling steadily. Sea state 4. Swell from the east-southeast. Tropical disturbance forming east of Luzon. He hesitated before adding a final note. Recommend caution, possible intensification within 24 hours. He carried the report to the duty officer, bowed, and withdrew. The paper would never reach the Admiral's desk. On the Zuikaku's bridge, Vice Admiral Jisaburō Ozawa stood beneath the red glow of the chart-room lamps. The map before him showed the Philippine Sea, a vast blue expanse marked by pencil lines converging on a single objective, the impending American invasion of Leyte. To the west lay Luzon. To the east, a chain of storms the Americans called tropical depressions, and the Japanese, with less precision, called seasonal winds. Ozawa's task was to lure Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet northward, away from the beaches of Leyte. His fleet was a decoy, and he knew it. His carriers carried more hope than aircraft. His pilots were barely trained boys. His bunkers were filled with just enough fuel to reach the combat zone and, perhaps, die there. At that same hour, hundreds of miles to the southwest, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force steamed through the Sibuyan Sea. The waves slapped against the grey hulls of battleships Yamato and Musashi, leviathans that once embodied Japan's faith in the doctrine of the Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. Every officer aboard knew what that meant. The war would be won or lost in one great engagement. But the ocean had its own plans, and tonight its breath was turning warm and erratic. Onshore, in the Imperial Japanese Navy's Hydrographic and Meteorological Department in Tokyo, a telegram flickered through the teleprinter at exactly 0145. Tropical depression east of Luzon, coordinates 14 north, 136 east. Barometric pressure 1008 millibars, falling rapidly. The duty forecaster, Lieutenant Commander Minoru Hata, read the message twice. The numbers suggested rapid development, but the fleet was already at sea, and communications security meant that routine wireless warnings were restricted. He prepared 2 separate versions of his report, one cautious, one urgent. By the time both drafts reached combined fleet headquarters at Kure, the decision had already been made. The operation would proceed. Weather would not stop the Emperor's navy. The Admiralty staff meeting at dawn on October 12th was short and absolute. Rear Admiral Tomiji Koyanagi, Chief of Staff to Admiral Kurita, summarized the position reports from the various task groups. Fuel reserves were perilously low. Each destroyer carried barely enough oil for 10 days of operations. Tankers were exhausted, convoys annihilated. Turning back would mean surrendering the Philippines and, with it, Japan's access to the oil of the Dutch East Indies. Kurita's jaw tightened. "If we delay for weather, we will never sail again," he said quietly. "We go forward." In that single sentence lay the fate of an entire fleet. By mid-morning, ships of the combined fleet were moving in 3 separate forces. Ozawa's northern force, 4 carriers, 2 battleships, and a handful of cruisers and destroyers steamed north of Luzon. Kurita's center force, 5 battleships, including Yamato and Musashi, 10 heavy cruisers, and a screen of destroyers pressed westward through the Sibuyan Sea. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force advanced through the narrow Surigao Strait. None of them possessed reliable meteorological data beyond a day's forecast. The Imperial Navy's last functioning weather reconnaissance aircraft had been lost in September. What remained were fragments, barometer readings, sailors' intuition, and the misplaced faith that the ocean would obey the will of men. The ocean did not obey. As the day lengthened, the barometer kept falling. The wind shifted by degrees, swinging from the northeast to the east, then south. Sky and water merged into a colorless horizon. The sun vanished behind a grey curtain. On Ozawa's flagship, young signalmen struggled to keep their balance as the deck began to pitch. Spray burst over the bow, drenching lookouts to the waist. Aircraft lashed. Down on the flight deck began to creak against their tie-down chains. The carrier's flight officer logged a warning. Deck operations unsafe beyond Beaufort Force 6. No order came to reduce speed. In the wardroom, officers discussed the Americans' approach. Reports from Japanese intelligence suggested that Admiral Halsey's task forces, laden with new Essex-class carriers, were advancing north from the Carolines. The Japanese High Command believed, or wanted to believe, that a perfectly timed decoy operation could draw Halsey away from Leyte and expose the American invasion fleet. Every minute mattered. To pause for weather would be to forfeit the last chance at a decisive battle. Even as the wind howled against the bridge windows, Ozawa's staff continued drafting signal orders for airstrikes that would never launch. Aboard Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, the ship's chief engineer recorded that the great vessel rolled more than 12 degrees to port during the evening watch. Seawater sloshed in her half-empty fuel tanks, creating unstable ballast. Officers muttered about the weather but avoided the word typhoon. It was considered unpatriotic to invoke natural misfortune when the emperor's orders demanded advance. Instead, they spoke of rough seas and temporary disturbances. The fleet maintained formation at 18 knots, each ship locked in line ahead, bow plunging into the rising Pacific swells like steel into resistance. By nightfall, lightning flickered over the eastern horizon. The sky pulsed white, then black. Destroyers disappeared behind walls of spray. Radio reception dissolved into static. Still, the order held. Maintain course, maintain speed. Pride was stronger than prudence. No one dared suggest a deviation that might imply weakness of spirit. The Imperial Navy's culture of obedience left no room for weather to dictate fate. Onshore, the meteorological Lieutenant Hatta finally received barometer readings from Luzon stations. The pressure had collapsed to 998 millibars. He drafted an urgent warning for transmission to combined fleet. Tropical cyclone intensifying rapidly east of Luzon. Estimated track northwest, risk to fleet operations high. The message was encoded, sent, and somewhere between Tokyo and the flagship, lost in transmission. By the time it was resent 12 hours later, the fleet was already in the storm's path. In the dim hours before dawn on October 13th, the sea turned savage. Wind screamed through rigging like wire under tension. On Zuikaku, an aircraft broke free from its moorings and slid across the flight deck before smashing against the island superstructure. Men wrestled to secure the rest, shouting above the storm. The petty officer who had first logged the falling pressure watched waves climb higher than the flight deck and realized his warning had meant nothing. Doctrine had overruled data. Faith had silenced. Forecast. At 0400, Admiral Ozawa received his last clear message from the Fleet Meteorological Section. Barometer continues to fall. Winds exceeding 60 knots. Recommend altering course. He read it once, then folded the paper. We cannot alter destiny, he said. Signal all ships maintain formation. And so they did. Into a sea rising toward ruin, bound by obedience and belief, the fleet that could no longer fight sailed straight into the waiting heart of the typhoon. In the years before the war, long before the waves of the Philippine Sea began to rise against them, the Imperial Japanese Navy had built its identity around an idea, Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. Every officer in the fleet, from midshipmen to admirals, carried the phrase like scripture. The concept was born in the aftermath of the Russo-Japanese War and refined through decades of war games at the Naval Staff College. Japan, smaller in industrial might and population than the United States, could never hope to win a long war of attrition. Therefore, the Navy would preserve its forces until the Americans advanced deep into the Western Pacific, then annihilate them in a single, decisive clash. It was elegant, mathematical, fatal, and by 1944, disastrously obsolete. The doctrine shaped everything: ship design, fuel allocation, even how commanders thought about weather. A decisive fleet could not turn aside for wind or rain. To do so was to admit that something greater than the emperor's will existed. And so, from the first days of the Pacific War, the Japanese Navy treated the Pacific Ocean less as an environment to understand than as an obstacle to conquer. The sea was an enemy to endure, not a system to study. At the Naval Aerological Center in Tokyo, the nation's best meteorologists worked with tools a generation behind their American counterparts. The Japanese lacked the long-range weather reconnaissance aircraft that the U.S. Navy deployed daily from Guam and the Marshalls. Their synoptic maps were drawn by hand from barometer readings taken by merchant vessels, many of which had been sunk by 1944. By then, the Imperial Navy's weather data for the entire Western Pacific came from fewer than 20 functioning observation points. Even those were subject to censorship if the reports were deemed defeatist. After the war, during the Allied interrogations of surviving Japanese officers, one meteorologist named Commander Masao Tsukada would admit the truth plainly. Our science was sound, but our doctrine forbade its application. Weather was treated as a test of spirit. If the fleet suffered, it was a lesson in endurance, not a failure of prediction. This belief collided fatally with the industrial logic of modern war. By 1944, the United States Navy had converted meteorology into a weapon. Fleet weather centers operated from Pearl Harbor to Brisbane, feeding continuous data through encrypted radio networks. Navy aircraft flew daily meteorological reconnaissance, MET flights, thousands of miles out into the Pacific, tracking typhoons before they formed. The information was analyzed by trained aerologists, then translated into precise operational guidance: sea states, wind vectors, cloud ceilings for carrier launches. For the Americans, weather was not divine whim. It was measurable, predictable, exploitable. The Imperial Japanese Navy, bound by pride and scarcity, saw such thinking as weakness. To rely on forecasts was to rely on numbers rather than courage. Their battleship captains boasted of standing watch through storms without altering course, as if endurance itself were victory. Every naval review emphasized the moral superiority of the Japanese sailor, the Yamato Damashi, the spirit of the nation. In classrooms at the Naval Academy in Etajima, cadets were taught that technology and weather were merely the stage upon which bravery acted. The lesson sank deep. The stronger will would always prevail, even against nature. By 1944, that will had become delusion. Japan's industry was shattered, its fleet starved of fuel, its pilots untrained, yet the same doctrine that had promised salvation now demanded sacrifice. When meteorologists warned that tropical disturbances might interfere with operations, senior officers dismissed them as timid. "The Americans fly through storms," one staff captain barked in early October. "We will sail through them." In truth, the Americans did not fly blindly through anything. When Admiral Halsey's fleet operated in the same waters weeks later, his ships received hourly weather reports from aircraft hundreds of miles ahead. He could adjust course by a few degrees and save entire task groups. The Japanese, blind to those invisible forces, were sailing by faith and inertia. Doctrine also dictated hierarchy. A subordinate could not countermand an order from above, even if that order meant destruction. Captain Yasumi Toyama, a staff officer later captured at Manila, described the paralysis in his interrogation report. Once the operation was approved by Combined Fleet, no one dared to raise questions of weather. To suggest delay was to invite suspicion of defeatism. We had a saying, "Even if the gods send lightning, the fleet sails on." Lightning did come, and the fleet did sail on. Inside the Admiralty buildings in Tokyo, The hydrographic and meteorological department occupied only one small corridor, tucked between the navigation and communications offices. Its reports were often rewritten by operations staff before being shown to senior admirals. The result was what one historian later called bureaucratic filtration of reality. By the time a weather warning reached the fleet, its language had been softened. Possible rough seas replaced dangerous gale. Tropical, low, replaced developing, typhoon. This cultural distortion would prove fatal. The Japanese fleet in October 1944 was a fragile machine held together by ritual and willpower. Its destroyers were overloaded with armament, top-heavy from added anti-aircraft guns, and chronically short of ballast water because of fuel conservation. They were ships designed for calm seas, not typhoon swells. Yet every operational plan assumed ideal conditions. The concept of postponement for weather was alien. On the eve of Operation Shogo 1, Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, gathered his staff and proclaimed, "The fate of the Empire will be decided in the waters of the Philippines. If we fail here, Japan will fall. All forces, regardless of cost, will advance." Not a single meteorological officer was present at that conference. The sea itself had no vote. As dusk fell over Tokyo that night, the last full moon before the typhoon rose over the bay. Its light shone on the empty moorings where the Yamato, Musashi, and Zuikaku had once anchored. To the men who watched from shore, it looked like destiny in motion, the great fleet sailing to write a final chapter in history. To the sea, indifferent and ancient, it was merely a matter of pressure gradients and wind shear. When the first gale-force winds struck the fleet 2 days later, the sailors cursed their luck. But there was no luck in it. There had been warnings, barometers, telegrams, clouds rising like grey towers over the horizon, all ignored in obedience to a doctrine that could not bend. In the end, it was not just ships that were destroyed in that storm. It was the idea that willpower could master physics, that faith could replace science, and that courage could command the weather. The Kantai-Kessen doctrine had promised that one perfect battle would decide the war. The ocean was about to provide one not between fleets, but between belief and reality. Dawn broke over the Philippine Sea like a blade through cloud, cold light spilling across the grey water and revealing a formation of ships already labouring under the weight of wind and wave. It was October 13th, 1944. A thin rain fell over the decks of Zuikaku, striking metal like the ticking of a clock counting down to catastrophe. On the bridge, signalmen watched the horizon vanish in sheets of mist. The sea had turned the colour of lead. Somewhere beyond that haze, the future of the Imperial Navy was disintegrating in silence, not from enemy fire, but from the invisible hand of weather. At 0600, the Zuikaku's meteorology officer submitted his second report in less than 12 hours. The barometer had dropped to 999 millibars. Wind velocity exceeded 40 knots. Waves struck from the east-southeast, steepening faster than the crew could believe. The officer's handwriting, neat at the start of the day, now trembled across the page. Strong gale approaching from the east. Recommend reducing speed, altering course south. The report was transmitted to the flagship's communications center and encoded for transmission to Vice Admiral Jisaburō Ozawa's entire northern force. It was never sent. An aide from operations intercepted it, glancing at the text before frowning. "The Admiral will not want to see this before the staff meeting," he muttered, slipping the paper into a folder marked Routine Meteorological Reports. By the time anyone noticed, the folder had been filed in the morning's backlog. The signal, the last chance to divert the fleet, died in bureaucracy. At 700 hours, Vice Admiral Ozawa convened his senior officers in the chart room. The atmosphere was tense, perfumed by damp wool and stale tobacco. Every man in the room knew that the enemy's next move would be the invasion of Leyte. Radio intelligence confirmed heavy American traffic to the east, but the details were scarce. Ozawa's task was to Safal, act as bait to draw Admiral Halsey's powerful carrier groups north, away from the landings. It was a suicide mission disguised as strategy. The carriers Zuikaku, Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho carried only a few dozen operational aircraft between them, but the decoy would work, or it would not. Weather did not enter the conversation. During that meeting, a junior staffer hesitated at the doorway, clutching another report, this one from the Imperial Navy's Hydrographic and Meteorological Department in Tokyo. It had arrived through the fleet's limited wireless channel, a string of Morse code that had taken nearly 20 minutes to decode through static, barometric pressure falling rapidly across North Philippine Sea. Tropical depression forming east of Luzon. Caution advised for fleet operations. The staffer waited for a pause, but Ozawa was already leaning over the table, tracing the plotted course with his finger. "We will maintain bearing 210, he said. "Signal the formation. Increase speed to 18 knots. We must reach our operating area by tomorrow evening." The staffer saluted, withdrew, and never delivered the message. That single unspoken report would be noted months later in the fleet communications log, missing probable clerical error. By late morning, the first squalls arrived, black columns marching across the water, flattening the horizon. The destroyers at the edge of the formation vanished into curtains of rain, their masts appearing and disappearing like ghosts. Waves slammed against their bows, forcing them to slow. Yet, the signal from the flagship demanded speed and formation discipline. The destroyers pushed their engines beyond safety limits, propellers thrashing, boilers trembling under strain. In one of the escort ships, Akizuki, Chief Engineer Masayoshi Ito recorded the moment the ship rolled 20 degrees to port. "The sea is wrong," he wrote in his log. "The wind changes direction each hour. It is as if the ocean has lost its mind." 1,000 miles away, in Tokyo, the Imperial Navy's Meteorological Office confirmed his fear. The tropical disturbance east of Luzon had deepened into a full typhoon, its central pressure falling below 980 millibars. Its projected path led directly into the area now occupied by Ozawa's northern force. The department transmitted a high-priority alert at 1300 hours. But Japanese radio procedure, designed to prevent enemy interception, required signals to be relayed through multiple security stations. The message took 7 hours to reach the fleet, decoded only after midnight, long after the first waves had begun breaking over carrier decks. Aboard the Zuikaku, the storm built with terrifying precision. Each hour the wind strengthened, howling through rigging, stripping paint from bulkheads. The horizon vanished entirely, replaced by a grey dome of rain and sea. Aircraft lashed to the deck began to shift against their tie-downs. Sailors struggled to reinforce them, shouting over the wind. One fighter broke loose and slid across the pitching deck, shearing off its wing before bursting into flames. The order came to jettison all remaining planes into the sea. By nightfall, the Zuikaku, once the proud spear of the Pearl Harbor raid, carried no air group at all. In the destroyers, conditions were worse. They were small, top-heavy, and exhausted. Their fuel tanks were nearly dry, leaving them with little ballast to steady their rolls. Without fuel, they floated high and light, perfect victims for the oncoming typhoon. Their captains requested permission to alter course individually for safety, but the flagship's radio operator transmitted the same response again and again: maintain formation, maintain speed. Each repetition cost another ship its stability. As night descended, lightning clawed across the clouds, illuminating a sea gone mad. Towering waves struck from all directions, at once, shattering the fleet's tight formation into chaos. Destroyers lost visual contact with the carriers they were meant to protect. Communication circuits collapsed under static. Above the noise, the crews could hear the wind, a sound like torn steel, rising to a continuous scream. And still, from the flagship came the same unwavering order: maintain formation. In the early hours of October 14th, the typhoon's eye crossed directly over the fleet. Winds reached over 100 knots. The carriers rolled like dying animals. On the Chiyoda, the aft flight deck ripped away entirely, exposing hangars below. Men were swept overboard by the dozen. The destroyer Hatsuzuki vanished from radar screens and never reappeared. Yet, in the official operations log, the reason for her loss was written in sterile language: missing, presumed enemy action. When dawn finally came, the sea was white with foam and debris, aircraft floats, life rafts, bodies. The storm had passed, but so had the illusion of control. On the bridge of Zuikaku, Admiral Ozawa looked out over the ruin and said nothing. He knew the truth, though it would never appear in the reports sent to Tokyo. They had ignored the signal, and the ocean had answered. The Typhoon had not merely destroyed ships, it had stripped away the last veneer of discipline that bound the Imperial Navy together. Far to the west, Admiral Kurita's center force was still steaming toward the Sibuyan Sea, unaware that the weather which had torn Ozawa's fleet apart now lay directly in his path. The message warning him of the storm, the same signal ignored in Tokyo, delayed again by radio security, was still bouncing between relays, its simple warning reduced to static in the void. Typhoon approaching. Alter course immediately. No one heard it in time. By the morning of October 14th, 1944, the Typhoon no longer needed to be found. It had found them. To the men of the center force, under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, the first sign was not the wind, but the color of the sky. It turned the shade of tarnished copper, an unnatural hue that sailors instinctively feared. The barometers aboard Yamato and Musashi plunged below 985 millibars, and every man who had spent time at sea knew what that meant. Still, Kurita's orders remained unchanged. Maintain course, maintain speed, proceed toward the San Bernardino Strait. The battle for Leyte was imminent, and the fleet's honor depended on it. But nature does not read operation orders. At 0800 hours, as the fleet steamed through the Sibuyan Sea, the first gusts struck sharp, uneven bursts that rattled antennas and sent spray over the main decks. By 1000 hours, the gusts had become a solid wall of wind. The Yamato, pride of the empire and largest warship ever built, began to roll 20 degrees with each swell. Men braced against bulkheads, clutching steel as if it could defy physics. Officers on the bridge stared out through glass covered in salt and rain, unable to distinguish horizon from sky. In the chart room, Chief Meteorological Officer Lieutenant Commander Tatsuya Morimoto traced the Typhoon's course with a pencil that trembled in his hand. "Admiral," he said quietly, "this storm is moving faster than we estimated. The center will cross our track within hours." Kurita did not answer. He was staring at the engine telegraph, listening to the rumble below decks, the heartbeat of a fleet that could no longer steer its own fate. "We will press on," he said finally. "Our destiny lies ahead, not behind." The truth was simpler. Turning back would burn too much fuel, and the fleet no longer had enough. The Yamato's bunkers were half empty, destroyers were running on fumes. If they turned away and were caught adrift, they would be helpless targets for American aircraft once the weather cleared. The only hope lay in forward motion, or so doctrine demanded. The sea rose higher. Waves crested 30 feet, then 40. The smaller ships vanished entirely behind moving walls of water. Destroyers rolled until their masts touched the surface, then righted again, shuddering like living creatures. On the heavy cruiser Tone, sailors chained themselves to gun mounts to avoid being washed overboard. One young signalman, barely 18, was swept away anyway. The men on deck watched helplessly as the sea swallowed him whole, his white cap spinning once before vanishing into grey foam. No one even shouted, the wind stole every sound. At noon, communication with the flagship failed. Antennas snapped, radio waves dissolved into static. The Yamato could only signal by light, but visibility had dropped to nothing. The fleet was blind and deaf. Ships that had sailed together for years could now only guess at each other's positions. More than once, a destroyer passed within yards of a battleship, its bow nearly colliding in the screaming rain. The Typhoon had assumed command. At 1300 hours, Musashi's engineering officer logged the roll angle at 28 degrees. A few minutes later, the number rose to 32. Loose shells in the magazines clanged like thunder as they shifted with each roll. Captain Toshihira Inaguchi, pacing the bridge, finally gave the order to counterflood ballast tanks to stabilize the ship. But the pumps could not keep up. The great battleship began to list to port, groaning like an animal in pain. Every man aboard knew the irony. This was the same ship designed to endure the heaviest American bombardment, yet she now fought for her life against wind and water. By mid-afternoon, the Typhoon's eye passed directly over the fleet. For 30 surreal minutes, the sea flattened. Clouds split open to reveal a circle of eerie blue sky. The wind dropped to silence. Sailors staggered from below decks, blinking in disbelief. Some wept openly. Others simply stared at the ocean, littered with debris, life rafts, crates, even a section of Yamato's forward catapult that had been ripped from the deck. On Yamato's bridge, Kurita lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "It seems the storm has spared us," he said. Lieutenant Commander Morimoto shook his head. "Admiral, the eye will pass quickly. The other side will be worse." Kurita's gaze drifted toward the horizon, where the wall of cloud already towered, black and immense. "Then we shall face it," he said softly, "as soldiers of the Emperor." The eye wall struck 20 minutes later. It came like an explosion, a single monstrous gust that knocked men from their feet and sent the Yamato heeling 35 degrees to port. Water poured across the deck, flooding compartments through open hatches. The fleet's formation shattered. One destroyer, Naganami, rolled completely onto her side and did not recover. 2 others vanished from radar. Their names, Asashimo and Kishinami, would later appear only in appendices of loss reports, their destruction attributed vaguely to weather conditions. By evening, the fleet had ceased to be a fleet at all. The Yamato survived, barely. Her armor had saved her from bombs, but not from physics. Her engines still turned, though half her radio masts were gone. Her sister ships were scattered across hundreds of miles. The sea was strewn with wreckage, twisted gun barrels, rafts, fragments of wood painted in imperial grey. When the wind finally eased after nightfall, the survivors emerged to find the ocean eerily calm. The Typhoon had moved west toward Luzon, leaving behind silence broken only by the hiss of waves against hulls. Kurita stood alone on the bridge, his uniform soaked, his eyes hollow. "Report our losses," he said. Morimoto hesitated. "Admiral, we cannot yet know how many." The first estimates came at dawn. 2 destroyers missing, 1 cruiser heavily damaged, dozens of aircraft destroyed or swept overboard. But the damage ran deeper than steel. The fleet's formation discipline, its confidence, even its faith in command, all were gone. The officers whispered that the Typhoon had done what the Americans could not. It had broken the Imperial Navy's will. In Tokyo, the Meteorological Department's final report for October 14th noted, "Typhoon No. 23, east of Luzon. Peak winds 140 knots. Track west-northwest. Estimated losses to fleet operations unknown." There was no mention of ignored warnings, no admission of fault. The phrase unknown concealed the truth. The storm had not been unforeseen. It had simply been dismissed. For the sailors who clung to the railings that night, watching the battered fleet drift apart under a pale moon, it no longer mattered. The doctrine of Kantai Kessen, the faith that willpower could overcome material disadvantage, had met its real enemy, and it was not the United States Navy. It was the Pacific itself. October 15th, 1944. Dawn rose pale and cold over the western Pacific, revealing a graveyard. The storm had passed, but the sea was still heavy with the weight of what it had destroyed. Waves rolled lazily beneath a sky scoured clean of clouds, the air smelling of oil and salt. Across hundreds of miles, ships of the once mighty combined fleet drifted like debris, rudderless, scattered, their radio antennas twisted into knots. The Typhoon had spent its fury, but the silence it left behind was worse than the roar. On the Yamato, the world's largest battleship, the decks were slick with seawater and diesel. Crewmen moved like ghosts, clearing wreckage from the upper works. broken lifeboats, twisted railings, the torn remains of signal flags, all evidence that the sea had been the true victor. Inside the bridge, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita sat in the command chair, his face drawn and grey. His cap was gone, lost during the storm, and his hair, once precisely combed, hung damp over his forehead. Chief of Staff Rear Admiral Tomiji Koyanagi read aloud the latest reports. We have confirmed the loss of Naganami and Asashimo. Kishinami presumed sunk. Tone damaged, steering compromised. Multiple destroyers suffering engine failures. Fuel reserves below minimum operating level. He paused, glancing at the Admiral. Communications with Musashi remain uncertain. Kurita said nothing. He stared through the bridge windows at the horizon, where smoke hung low, curling from unseen wrecks. Every officer aboard understood the truth. The fleet had been mauled without a single shot fired by the enemy. Yet the operation, by Tokyo's orders, was still underway. The Americans would land at Leyte within days, and the Imperial Navy was expected to strike. The irony was unbearable. To delay now for repairs or refueling would mean disobedience. To advance would mean annihilation. The Typhoon had made that choice for them. Far to the north, what remained of Vice Admiral Ozawa's northern force limped across calmer seas. The carriers, Chiyoda and Chitose, were gone, swallowed by the storm. Zuikaku had survived, her decks warped, her hangars flooded, her air group destroyed. Ozawa's remaining ships managed no more than 10 knots. His staff sent a coded message to Tokyo describing severe weather damage, a phrase that would later be reduced in official communiques to moderate operational impact. The Imperial Navy did not admit defeat, not even to itself. At the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, the mood was one of delusion dressed as duty. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, received the meteorological summary with detached calm. The Hydrographic Department's warning, sent too late, was quietly removed from the operation files. The cause of losses was attributed to unforeseen weather phenomena. No one dared to speak the words ignored or avoidable. The Emperor's officers could not be seen to have erred. The fleet, they told themselves, remained a weapon of destiny. But among the sailors who survived the storm, the mythology of invincibility was gone. On Yamato, Petty Officer Masao Ito wrote in his diary, "We endured the wind, we endured the sea. Yet, I think we cannot endure the truth. We built ships to fight men, not nature. The sea does not care for emperors." His words would never reach Tokyo. He died 10 days later in the Sibuyan Sea, when Musashi went down under American air attack. Throughout that day, the survivors struggled to restore order. Engineers worked feverishly to patch steam lines, dry electrical circuits, and purge seawater from fuel tanks. The fleet's medical sections treated hundreds of injuries, crushed limbs, burns, hypothermia. Many men were missing. Others were too shaken to speak. The smell of sickness and salt water hung in every corridor. The storm had passed, but its memory clung like humidity. In the afternoon, the weather cleared completely. Sunlight spread over the wreckage, revealing the full scale of destruction. The Yamato's main radar mast was bent 30 degrees, her starboard aircraft catapult torn from its base. Across the formation, destroyers listed, their decks warped, their gun turrets rust-streaked from seawater. The fleet looked like what it truly was, a relic of an empire in its death throes, polished steel wrapped around exhaustion. That evening, Kurita received the long-delayed meteorological message from Tokyo, the same one that had been transmitted before the storm struck. The paper, creased and water-stained, arrived 2 days too late. He read it once and then folded it carefully. "We are warned after the sea has spoken," he said. "What purpose does prophecy serve after the temple is gone?" No one answered. The center force would sail on, crippled but obedient, toward the coming battle off Leyte. Many of the men who survived the typhoon would die within the week under American bombs and shells. Yet none of those weapons would strike as deeply as the realization born in those quiet hours after the storm, that the Empire of Japan had not merely lost ships, it had lost the illusion that courage could command the elements. For the rest of their lives, the survivors would remember that silence, the calm that followed the typhoon's roar, the still air heavy with oil and death, the feeling of standing on the deck of a ship too large to turn and too proud to retreat. It was, as one officer later said, the moment the sea reminded us who ruled the Pacific. October 16th, 1944. The sky above the Philippine Sea was clear once more, washed clean by the typhoon's rage. The morning light glinted off battered hulls and twisted steel, the sea deceptively calm, as if nothing had happened. But the silence carried the memory of a night when the ocean had devoured men and machines with equal appetite. The typhoon had passed, yet its shadow lingered in the faces of the sailors, in the quiet corridors of command, and in the reckoning that would soon follow. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force limped westward through oily swells. The Yamato's massive bow cleaved the water like a wounded leviathan, her crew working in grim silence. On the horizon, faint columns of smoke marked where other ships struggled to rejoin formation. The radio room was alive, with static fragments of voices, broken call signs, distorted reports. Some destroyers were missing entirely. Others replied with messages so faint that even the signalman hesitated to confirm them as human speech. The fleet's doctors moved from ship to ship, treating frostbite, concussion, and exhaustion. The dead were sewn into canvas bags, weighted with shell casings, and lowered into the sea. Chaplains murmured prayers into the wind, their words carried away by the same force that had taken so many lives. Kurita stood on Yamato's bridge with his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Tomiji Koyanagi. Both men were silent for a long time, listening to the creak of the damaged ship. Finally, Koyanagi spoke. "Admiral, the men need rest. Some of the destroyers have no fuel left. We should turn back." Kurita did not look at him. "If we return now, we abandon the Philippines. The army will say the navy fled." Koyanagi's voice hardened. "If we continue, we may have no fleet left to fight." Kurita closed his eyes. "Then we will die with honor." That word honor had guided the Imperial Navy for decades. It had driven the Yamato's construction, the suicide torpedo programs, and the doomed defense of island after island. But in the wake of the typhoon, it sounded hollow. The men had seen the truth of nature's indifference. The storm had not cared for rank or courage, for Bushido or the Emperor. It had only cared for wind and pressure, for the laws of physics written in water and air. Far to the north, Vice Admiral Jisaburō Ozawa's northern force was a ruin adrift. His flagship, Zuikaku, once the pride of the Pearl Harbor strike, could barely make steam. Her flight deck was buckled, her radar gone, her air group scattered or destroyed. The remaining ships formed a loose, weary line. In the officers' mess, men sat wrapped in blankets, sipping thin soup, their eyes vacant. Ozawa's operations officer recorded in the log, "Typhoon damage severe, morale low. All aircraft expended or lost, fleet reduced to decoy status only." In Tokyo, the Hydrographic and Meteorological Department submitted its after-action report. It was a document written in cautious bureaucratic language, but between the lines lay tragedy. Tropical cyclone. No. 23 developed east of Luzon, path predicted with moderate confidence. Communication delays prevented timely transmission to forward units. In the margin, a clerk had scribbled a note that no one would ever read aloud, warnings ignored by command. That afternoon, a signal arrived aboard Yamato from Combined Fleet Headquarters. It bore the signature of Admiral Soemu Toyoda himself. "All forces proceed with Operation Show, -1. Engage the enemy at Leyte Gulf. The fate of the Empire depends upon decisive action." Kurita folded the paper carefully, his fingers trembling. Around him, the bridge officers stood at attention, waiting for orders. He looked out at the grey expanse of sea and said quietly, "The typhoon did not destroy us so that we could run. Then, more firmly, signal the fleet. Resume course towards San Bernardino Strait. The helmsman hesitated just a moment, but enough for everyone to feel the weight of it. Then he turned the wheel. Slowly, the Yamato's bow swung southwest. One by one, the surviving ships followed. The fleet that the Typhoon had nearly erased was now steaming toward an even greater disaster, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. As the day wore on, the wind fell silent, and the sea calmed into a glassy expanse. The sun set red behind the distant mountains of Luzon. The sailors watched it fade and wondered if they would ever see another. In that moment, nature had finished its lesson. The ocean had shown them that pride and obedience could be as deadly as enemy fire, yet the lesson would go unheeded. Within a week, half the ships that had survived the storm would lie on the bottom of the sea, not from weather, but from bombs, torpedoes, and their own blind faith in destiny. Years later, at a post-war conference in 1953, a surviving officer from Yamato would say quietly to an American historian, "The Typhoon was our first defeat. Leyte was only the second. October 17th, 1944. The Yamato cut through a calm sea beneath skies so blue they seemed to mock what had come before. Only 3 days had passed since the Typhoon, yet time aboard the ship felt distorted, stretched by exhaustion and disbelief. The ocean had returned to serenity, but the men had not. They moved with the wary quiet of survivors who had seen too much. The decks, though scrubbed clean, still bore the faint smell of oil and salt that no amount of work could erase. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's fleet, the center force, steamed toward the San Bernardino Strait, battered but obedient. The Typhoon had failed to stop them, though it had stripped them bare. Many destroyers carried less than 1/3 fuel. Their engines coughed black smoke, their bilges still full of seawater. Sailors patched holes in hulls with sheet metal and prayer. The mighty Imperial Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, now looked like a convoy of survivors pretending to be warriors. Kurita stood on Yamato's bridge beside Rear Admiral Koyanagi, both men gazing toward the western horizon. In the clear light, the Philippines appeared as a faint grey silhouette the edge of their final battlefield. "We are ghosts now," Koyanagi said, softly. "The storm left us half dead, yet they send us to finish the dying." Kurita's expression did not change. "Ghosts still have orders." Below decks, the crew worked in silence. The galley served rice and pickled vegetables, what little remained of the fleet's provisions. Mechanics dried electrical circuits with rags and heat lamps. Gunners polished their barrels, even though many mounts no longer traversed properly. Each man did his task as if clinging to ritual could ward off the inevitable. The Typhoon had taught them one lesson clearly. The sea did not forgive hesitation. By midday, the fleet's radio room received transmissions from the Hydrographic and Meteorological Department in Tokyo. The reports spoke of clear skies ahead, moderate seas, and light winds. The irony was not lost on the signalman. The same institution whose warnings had been ignored now promised smooth sailing, as if absolution could be issued in Morse code. Aboard the light cruiser Tone, Lieutenant Taro Minobe sat in the wardroom writing a letter to his wife in Hiroshima. "Yesterday the sea was like glass," he wrote. "It seems impossible that the same waters could rise so high. I thought of you during the storm, not because I feared death, but because I realized how small men truly are. We command steel, but the sea commands us." He folded the letter neatly, knowing it would never be sent. At 1500 hours, lookout stations reported wreckage off the port bow planks, an empty life raft, a floating section of hull plating marked in faded hiragana, Chiyoda. The sea had carried it hundreds of miles from where the carrier sank. The sailors gathered along the rails in silence as it drifted past, rocking gently on the waves. One man saluted. No words were spoken. That evening, the officers assembled in the navigation room aboard Yamato. The atmosphere was subdued, the air thick with the smell of damp uniforms and cigarette smoke. Charts were spread across the table, showing the narrow strait ahead. Kurita traced a finger along the plotted course. "We will pass through San Bernardino at dawn tomorrow," he said. "After that, we engage the enemy." An officer at the far end of the table cleared his throat. "Admiral, if another storm were to form—" Kurita's hand froze. "The sea has already judged us," he said quietly. "Whatever comes now is merely execution of the sentence." Outside, the Pacific shimmered under a half-moon, deceptively tranquil. The storm had emptied itself days before, yet its memory lived in every man's bones. The survivors of the center force would soon face another kind of tempest, one made of fire and steel, not wind and water. But as they prepared for battle, many found themselves glancing upward at the stars, measuring the calm with suspicion, as though nature itself might strike again at any moment. In the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, the Emperor's staff reviewed the preliminary reports of the Typhoon's damage. The language was clinical, stripped of emotion. 1 carrier and 2 destroyers lost to severe weather. Estimated personnel losses, 800. The truth was closer to 3 times that number. The report ended with a line of calculated optimism. Fleet morale remains strong. But in the mess halls of Yamato, the sailors no longer spoke of glory. They whispered of the storm of comrades washed away, of decks that heaved like mountains, of the sound the wind made when it tore a ship apart. They spoke as men who understood that the Empire's power had already drowned. When night fell, Kurita walked alone on the weather deck. The sea stretched out before him, vast and indifferent. He thought of the typhoon of the wind howling like a living thing, of the destroyers rolling and vanishing, of the silence afterward. Somewhere beneath those same waters lay hundreds of his men, their bodies drifting in darkness. He looked toward the stars, and whispered to no one. "The sea remembers." And it did. It always would. October 18th, 1944. At first light, the center force entered the San Bernardino Strait, a narrow, island-choked passage where the Pacific meets the Sibuyan Sea in a churning knot of currents. The dawn air was heavy and metallic, the kind that carried both promise and warning. To the west lay Leyte Gulf, where the Americans would soon land their armies. To the east, the open ocean shimmered with deceptive calm, concealing the graves of ships lost to the typhoon only days before. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on the bridge of the Yamato, binoculars pressed to his eyes. The sea was glassy now, but he could not shake the memory of the storm's fury. The rhythm of the waves seemed almost sinister in their stillness. Around him, the officers whispered about the dead, the hundreds swept away, the ships that had vanished. The typhoon had taken more from them than steel and men. It had stripped away the illusion that courage alone could master nature. Rear Admiral Tomiji Koyanagi approached, his voice low. "Admiral, reconnaissance reports suggest the Americans are already massing east of Leyte. Our fuel reserves are dangerously low. Perhaps—" He hesitated, careful with his words. "Perhaps it is time to reconsider." Kurita's hand cut the air. "There is nothing to reconsider. The combined fleet does not retreat because of weather or odds. We advance. Always." His tone was measured but hollow, as though the conviction had been worn smooth by repetition. "If we fail to meet the enemy, we fail the Emperor, and if we die, then the sea will bury us with honor." Honor, that word again. It had become a ghost in every order, haunting every decision. The men no longer believed in victory, only in obedience. The fleet advanced in 3 columns. To starboard, the battleships, Yamato, Nagato, and Musashi, great fortresses of steel, their hulls still, streaked with rust from the storm. To port, heavy cruisers, Atago, Maya, and Chokai. Between them steamed the destroyers, weary and wounded, many of them running on vapors. Engineers nursed boilers like surgeons tending dying patients, coaxing every remaining knot from failing engines. The storm had reshaped their discipline. Gone was the precise geometry of Japanese naval formations, the immaculate lines drilled through years of parade ground precision. Now, the fleet's spacing wavered like handwriting on unsteady paper. A destroyer that strayed too far risked being lost. One that drew too close risked collision. Even nature's silence had become a threat. At 900 hours, the fleet's radio operators picked up faint transmissions from the 1st Air Fleet, Ozawa's decoy force to the north. The carriers were limping toward their final task, to lure Admiral Halsey's powerful 3rd Fleet away from Leyte. Their air wings were nearly non-existent, their flight decks still, warped by the Typhoon's winds, but their orders were clear to die conspicuously. Kurita listened to the static-laden message, his jaw tightening. He knew what Ozawa's sacrifice meant. The Imperial Navy was no longer fighting battles. It was performing a ritual of death, each fleet offering itself in sequence to delay the inevitable. The Typhoon had not broken that pattern, it had simply foreshadowed it. By midday, the sky began to darken again. Clouds gathered over the eastern horizon, grey veils thickening into a familiar shape. The barometer dropped another 3 millibars in an hour. On the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Tatsuya Morimoto frowned at his instruments. "Sir," he said cautiously, a new low-pressure system forming to the northeast. It could strengthen quickly. Koyanagi's head turned sharply. "Another typhoon?" "Too early to tell, Admiral. But the conditions—" Kurita silenced them both with a look. "We will not halt for shadows in the steppe clouds. The Americans will not wait for fair weather." Still, the unease spread through the fleet like a contagion. The men had learned too well what shadows in the clouds could become. Sailors checked lashings, closed hatches, and whispered prayers to the sea gods. A few joked bitterly that perhaps the ocean itself now fought for the Americans. At 1300 hours, Musashi's forward lookout reported debris drifting across the strait, shattered lifeboats, planks, and a half-submerged torpedo tube. They belonged to Naganami, one of the destroyers lost in the storm. As the fleet passed, men lined the rails in silence. The ocean was calm, almost unnaturally so. The wreckage bobbed gently, a quiet accusation. Kurita watched from the bridge. His expression did not change, but his eyes lingered on the fragments until they disappeared astern. "The sea keeps its records," he murmured. That afternoon, the weather turned again, not the full wrath of a typhoon, but a squall line, the storm's ghost returning to remind them who held dominion. Rain slashed across the decks, and wind howled through the rigging. Yet the fleet pressed on, forcing its way westward, every ship vibrating under the strain. As darkness fell, the wind eased, leaving behind a low, rhythmic swell. The clouds broke, revealing a sky filled with stars. The sea glittered like black glass. It was beautiful and terrifying. For men who had just survived nature's fury, the beauty of calm carried its own kind of menace, as though the ocean were merely pausing before another act of violence. In his cabin, Kurita opened his logbook and began to write. His handwriting was slow and deliberate. October 18th. We have survived the storm, but not its shadow. Men whisper of omens. I remind them that the sea is without mercy or malice. It obeys no emperor. It simply is. He paused, staring at the ink as it dried, then added a final line. Perhaps it is we who have disobeyed. Nature. Outside, the fleet steamed onward, wounded, diminished, but still bound by duty. Ahead lay Leyte, where the guns of the U.S. Navy waited. Behind them lay the Typhoon, its path marked by wreckage and ghosts. Between those two forces, the storm of nature and the storm of war sailed men who no longer believed they could survive either. In the calm before the next tempest, the Imperial Navy held its final illusion of control. But the sea, ancient and indifferent, had already decided their fate. It had judged their defiance once and would soon do so again.